I'm certainly grateful for the number who are here in this session. Russ mentioned two critical points in the introduction. This is a critical, sensitive, difficult topic, and I assume all of us, including myself, know a woman who has had an abortion, who has considered abortion, some saying yes, some saying no. And it impacts all of us very personally. Our daughters, perhaps even our wives, certainly sisters in the church. And as one addressing it as a male, I understand I will never know what it's like to walk in the shoes of a woman who perhaps has become pregnant, then abandoned by a worthless guy and says it's your problem now. And to know what that woman is going through, the trauma of the decisions that are before her, I can never walk in those shoes and understand all of the feelings and all the difficulties. So there will be, Lord willing, some sensitivity in keeping with the lecture this morning and the keynote. We want to speak the truth, but we want to do so in love and sensitivity and compassion. And I think particularly to those of us who are male, who have never walked that path before, nor will we. And Russ also mentioned that this is not new. Of course, when we think about abortion, we think of Roe v. Wade, 1973. We recently observed the 40th anniversary of it. But this is a very, very, very old technology. There is evidence of abortion in the ancient Near East 1,500 years before the time of Moses. When you read ancient Assyrian records and Babylonian records, cultures long before Moses are addressing the issue that we're addressing now. This is not new technology. This is not a new issue. It is a very, very, very old issue. I also want to stress as we talk about abortion that we're really talking about other issues other than this specific one. We're talking about issues that involve the destruction of the human embryo. Obviously, abortion is one of those. At minimum, we would all have to agree that when an abortion takes place, a being that is a human being at a very, very early stage of development is being destroyed. The life is being ended. But there are other technologies that are critical in our culture today that also involve the destruction of the human embryo. And these are some of those. Some of these we'll mention more at the afternoon session, embryonic stem cell research. There is some good news on the horizon that we might be able to take adult stem cells, tweak them back to an earlier stage of existence, help people suffering with Parkinson's and diabetes and other debilitating, life-threatening illnesses without the destruction of the human embryo. Right now, you can't harvest those embryonic stem cells without destroying the human embryo. Cloning, some forms of birth control, those that allow fertilization but prevent implantation. One could argue, if you believe that human life begins at conception, also involve embryo destruction. And there are some artificial reproductive technology procedures, especially in vitro fertilization, as it's practiced in the U.S., where we fertilize a great many more eggs than we plan to implant. So we're going to implant 2 or 3 eggs, but we might fertilize 6, 8 or more. What happens to those other eggs that have now been fertilized, that now if planted in a woman's womb, would eventually develop into a baby? Well, some are left by the hundreds of thousands in cold storage. Some eventually waste away. Some are purposely disaggregated for research. So there are a number of procedures besides abortion that deal with the destruction of the very, very, very early human embryo. Are you ready? Look how quick we're going through that, all right? I'm going to give you some good news with the bad news. The bad news is the number of abortions in America is still at the unthinkable level. But the numbers of abortion, the ratio of abortions, the rate of abortions, praise God, have been going down the last few decades. After the passing of, or the judgment of Roe v. Wade, abortions began to shoot through the roof in America. They peaked around 1990 with 1.5 million legal abortions reported to the CDC that year. Since 1990, the number and rate and ratio of abortions has actually been declining in America, including last year, by 2 to 3, even 5% some years. That's a little bit of good news on a very dark horizon. The bad news is we're still talking of numbers in the hundreds of thousands in America. Still upward of 800,000 a year. Just in America, and then to remind ourselves that America only accounts for 3% of all the abortions. You do the math. We're talking about tens of millions of human embryos and fetuses that are aborted worldwide each year. In terms of timing, and we want to be honest with this discussion when we talk to friends and neighbors or we counsel young women who are involved in a horrible decision-making process, we need to be honest on both sides of the issue. And from the pro-life side, which obviously I would place myself, I assume you would as well, the majority of abortions do take place in the first trimester at or before 13 weeks. In 2009, 91% of abortions had taken place at or before the 13th week. I say that to say if I'm going to be a part of a pro-life demonstration, perhaps it's a little disingenuous to carry a sign of a 25-week-old fetus as if to leave the impression that's what most of the fetuses look like which are being aborted. So on the pro-life side, I want to be honest with the evidence. On the pro-choice side, I would beg them to be honest with the evidence, and we're getting there just as quickly as we can. This is what we're facing in America. Right now, about half of pregnancies in America are unintended. So for all of our education in the sexual arena, for all of our provision of free condoms, for all of our provision of teaching our children how to have safe sex, a lot of it still ain't working. 50% of all pregnancies in America are not intentional. When a woman finds herself with an unintended pregnancy, here are the outcomes by percentage. 14% of those end up in natural miscarriages, nature's own abortion, as it were. 44% of those result in live births. My wife and I are recipients of 3 beautiful kids by adoption, who were, by their birth biological mothers, saved from abortion, that we might be blessed by adopting them. So I have a personal dog in this hunt, as we say in Arkansas. We have a personal stake because our family has been impacted in a positive way by women who found themselves in very difficult situations, who made the courageous choice not to abort the child, but to carry the child, not being able perhaps to raise it on her own, to allow a Christian couple like us to raise these children. But 42% of all of these unintended pregnancies wind up in an abortion. AGI stands for the Alan Guttmacher Institute. And it's important for me to say that if anything, the Guttmacher Institute leans pro-choice, not pro-life. And I say that because if this information shows up on a pro-choice leaning site, I'm fairly confident that the information, the data reported is accurate. This is the last study I could get my hands on. I don't know if further ones have been done, but this is a 2004 study. 1,200 women were interviewed, women who had had abortions, and the question was simply asked, why did you have the abortion? The women on average gave 4 reasons. These are the important reasons why I had an abortion, and then the women stated the most important reason. Now, this is where the pro-choice side has to be more honest than they've been. Whenever this comes up in the political arena from the presidential level on down, there is always this big heart-wrenching case made for what about women who have been raped? What about women who are victims of incest? And obviously that's unimaginable. We just can't even comprehend a woman, first of all, being violently abused in that way, and then finding themselves pregnant as a result of it. So certainly our hearts go out and we can be sympathetic and we can say, oh, the grief that these women are facing. But where we have to be honest with the data is the fact that the percentage of abortions for rape and incest combined, both of them together, account for less than 0.5% of the abortions in America. That is an issue. But it's not the issue that we deal with typically in our churches and in our families. Abortions because the woman has a health problem, what we call therapeutic abortion rather. The woman has been told, you are risking your health in some way by taking this pregnancy to term accounts for about 4% of abortions in America, and abortions because the fetus might have some serious health abnormality. That accounts for about 3% of abortions in America. The point is simply this. You put all of those in one category. Rape, incest, threat to the mother's health, threat in the sense of this fetus may have a serious health problem, will either not survive birth or will be severely handicapped the rest of his or her life. All of those together, 8% of the abortions in America. I wish pro-choice were more honest with that data. So I think for our discussion today, what I suggest we do is set aside those 8% right now. In my judgment, those involve a different set of ethical issues than the 92%. I'm not saying they're necessarily right or necessarily justified. I'm simply saying they involve a different set of ethical issues. One could, for example, not saying I would make the argument, but one could see one making the argument that a woman who is told by her physician, if you have this baby, it will kill you. One could argue the justification for an abortion on the biblical principle of self-defense. It's my life or the fetus/baby's life. Now, I know women who would not be willing to do even that. They would say, even if my life's threatened, I'm still going with a pregnancy. I understand that and I applaud that. But my point is, I think these 8% raise a different set of issues. So with your permission, well, I'm not really asking. This is what we're going to do. With your permission, I'm going to talk about this other 92%. This is where we will be dealing with it most of the time. So on this same research, why did you ladies have an abortion? They gave on average 4 reasons, and they specified the most important reason. These were the 3 most important reasons. I'm just not ready for the responsibility. I can't afford the baby right now, and I've had all the children I want. Then if you look at all of the reasons, so the list of, this is one of the 4 top reasons the ladies mentioned. Again, can't afford the baby was mentioned by 73% of the women. Has a problem with a relationship, 48%. Unmarried, 42%. And you can read the rest of the list. And when I read that list, this is where I'm thinking, this is where the church needs to step to the plate. And this is where the church, this is where our agencies, the arms of Christian folks who are caring for these pregnant ladies who are so lost. What am I going to do? This is going to change my life. I'm thinking this is where the church needs to be pro-life in every sense of the term. Not just protecting the child in the womb, but protecting these vulnerable ladies whose lives are being turned upside down with an unplanned pregnancy. And we hopefully can offer an alternative short of aborting the child they're carrying. And to stress other options, and in love and in kindness, but also in support, helping them financially, being the family to them that they have been abandoned by this worthless guy who got her pregnant and left the state. And for the church to surround them with love and to say and to mean it, we're going to be there for you. The bottom line is, in America, 92% of all abortions are elective. They're not because of rape and incest. They're not because the woman's life is threatened. They're not because the fetus might have some abnormality that would afflict them the rest of their life. They are simply for what reason? This is not a good time, or it is an inconvenience, or there are other reasons why this is not a good time for me to have a baby. Abortion is the premature expulsion of the human fetus. It occurs, quote, naturally in a miscarriage. We are talking with abortion about an intentional, deliberate expulsion of the fetus that does not happen naturally. We've already talked about the different kinds of abortions. On the induced abortions, that's the topic of this hour. I think it's very important to distinguish elective from these other kinds. Roe v. Wade, we know, 1973. Just as important, passed the same year, was Doe Bolton, which allowed the window to a woman to have an abortion if her, I'm going to put it in quotes, her health is threatened. But what Doe Bolton did was to define health not just as a threat to her physical life, but as a threat to her mental and emotional well-being. And I think that was very critical in the sense of that is very much open to subjective interpretation when you talk about mental and emotional health. And in some respects, though it hasn't gotten our attention, Doe v. Bolton was just as important a decision as Roe v. Wade in terms of the number of abortions. Just by way of historic interest, the woman Norma McCorvey, who is the original Roe in Roe v. Wade, she was the woman in Texas who wound up pregnant. In Texas, at that time, only allowed abortions if the physical life of the woman was threatened. And, the pro-abortion causes got a hold of this young woman. She becomes the poster child, eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court. As a matter of historical interest, Norma McCorvey of Roe v. Wade fame is now an ardent pro-lifer. And she also, in this book, I think it's fair to say, talks about the manipulation that took place for her to become the poster child, as it were, for the pro-abortion movement. As I seek to look at this ethically, as at least an amateur ethicist, let me suggest there are two values in collision. One is the value of autonomy. And I would argue that God has made us free will moral agents. And having choice is part of being created in the image and likeness of God. So autonomy is integral, is inherent to what we are as human beings. No one is arguing that. No one is denying that. I sure do not wish to do so. So we have this value of autonomy. I want to make decisions for my own body. I want to make my own medical decisions. I want to make the call. All of us feel strongly about that. Autonomy is a God-given gift, a right that needs to be exercised so very carefully. But in this case, my choice clashes with another value, and that is the value of the embryo fetus baby that is being carried in my womb. Does that entity have any rights? Certainly is not able to exercise autonomy in the same way the woman does. All the autonomy being exercised in abortion is the woman's autonomy, not the fetus's autonomy. Because no one can ask the fetus, what do you prefer, to be aborted or not to be aborted? In your wild imagination, if you could ask a fetus in the womb that, what do you think they're going to say? I prefer to live, thank you. And so we're in this interesting situation where the woman's autonomy receives, for obvious, understandable reasons, a lot of stake in this. The fetus's autonomy has no stake in it. Some would argue, well, they can't exercise autonomy yet, but no voice in it. But there is, in addition to that, the value that you place on the embryo fetus in the womb. What is that embryo fetus? Now, we're not talking about a situation where fertilization has taken place outside the womb in a petri dish in a research lab. We're talking about conception that has taken place in the woman's body. It has been implanted in the uterine wall. And if nature doesn't interfere and we don't interfere, what's going to happen in 9 months every time? There's going to be a human baby born. And there's never a surprise about this. I mean, there never in any hospital in America is it ever, whoa, look at that, we got another human baby again. What are the odds of that? We know this is what's going to happen once conception takes place, once the conceptus is implanted in the woman's uterine wall. Give it 9 months and the same thing happens every single time. This is pretty good Bible here. Autonomy is not an absolute unqualified good. We treat it in our culture as if it is. And really, I don't want to simplify this, but in my understanding of this particular question, the bottom line is, does the autonomy of the woman trump the right of the fetus to live? Now, if we're talking about any other human being, the answer is no. We can't exercise our autonomy to end the life of a person. Not a baby's life, not a teenager's life. I'm fighting the temptation to say, well, sometimes those of us who have raised teenagers would think about it. But not a teenager's life, not an adult life, not yours or mine. You don't have the autonomy to take my life, and I don't have the autonomy to take yours. Again, I'm not trying to simplify this complex issue, but for me, in my thinking, at the end of the day, it's rather simple. Question: does the woman's autonomy trump the right of the fetus to live? That is the ethics question. In America, we've said yes, without question, for the first trimester. In a more limited way, second trimester, even a more limited way, third trimester. There are philosophers and ethicists who are very, very serious about this next step. Why not extend this after the baby is born? And so there are philosophers teaching in major universities in America right now who are arguing for the legalization of infanticide. They have a point. One of them said, if you are for late-term abortion, you cannot be against infanticide. What morally relevant difference has taken place in the short journey down the vaginal canal? And he's right. If we're for late-term abortion, how can you be against infanticide? They seem to stand or fall together. And there are those, as we were arguing for Roe v. Wade a number of decades ago, we now have philosophers and ethicists arguing for legal infanticide. They are calling it, listen to this catchy term, they are calling it post-birth abortion, i.e. infanticide. There's one famous philosopher who says up to 2 years after birth, it ought to be legal. Right now we call that murder. Will we call it murder 20 years from now? I'm cynical enough to say I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So in my judgment, the big question is, what is the moral status of the human embryo in vivo in the woman's womb? What is the status? Well, here are the options. Is the fetus human life? Is the fetus a person? Philosophers make a distinction between biological human life and person, that is, a member of the moral community. So the argument behind the abortion movement is, well, unarguably the fetus is human life. I mean, it is biological human life with human DNA. That's unarguable. The question is, among those who are pushing this issue is, but the fetus does not have moral standing. The fetus is not a member of the moral community like you are. So of course we're against killing you. Of course we're against, for most, killing a baby, but the fetus is not a baby. The fetus does not have, in their view, this is not my view, their view, the fetus does not have the same moral standing. I'm going to move on at this point and just assume for time's sake and otherwise, we would all agree, if we've taken a basic biology class, that the human embryo fetus But starting from that single cell zygote stage, then through the embryonic stage, the fetal stage, we are talking about a being whose origin and source is human. I.e., we're talking about a human being, not another sort of being. We're talking about a human being. We're talking about a very, very young, immature member of the human being family that has the active disposition internally to actualize everything that it has the potential of becoming. From the time of conception, if nature doesn't interfere or we don't interfere, the newly conceived will develop into a born baby, as each one of you in this room did. Every one of you in this room was once a fetus, was once an embryo, was once a newly formed zygote. Every one of you in this room. So what are the options? Some argue that the embryo fetus should be granted the moral status of person. That's my view. I argue it biologically, I argue it biblically, I argue it theologically, I argue it even commonsensically. That this being in the womb is an early member of the human family. If this is true, then abortion is a case of killing that should only be taken under the same kinds of situations that would justify your killing me or my killing you. There would have to be serious reasons then to even contemplate taking the life of this human fetus. As I suggested, perhaps one could argue through a self-defense argument to having an abortion to save the physical life of the woman, which was essentially the law of the land before Roe v. Wade. That was what the court tossed out as being overly restrictive and unconstitutional. But that's generally what was agreed before Roe v. Wade. Abortions in those cases are a different kind of abortion. I hope to convince you that's also the biblical position. Position one. Option number two is the opposite. The fetus has no moral standing. It's not a person. It is just a lump of biological material. That having an abortion is a little different than having a gallbladder removed or having an appendectomy. We are just removing a part of the woman's body, and that shows up in the sloganeering. Hands off my body. You don't have a right to tell me what to do with my body. And generally speaking, I agree. Hands off my body too. Unless I give you permission. The question is the fetus just a part of the woman's body? Biologically, it doesn't even have the exact DNA that she has. Because it now has the combined DNA of the father and the mother biologically. It has a different set of DNA than the woman does. Not even body in the basic biological sense. Being carried by the body, nurtured by the body, sure. But to say the fetus is no different than the appendix or the gallbladder. You ever worried about a gallbladder becoming a baby? No. But that embryo will become a baby 9 months. Just hold on. All right? There is a difference. But if you hold this position, then having an abortion is of little moral consideration. The third option is what is reflected in Roe v. Wade, and I suspect it's what's reflected in the opinion of the majority of Americans, that the fetus is not a person. So many times I hear even Christians say, but look at that. That's not a baby. That doesn't look like a baby. Missing the point. Just give it 9 months. It has all of the internal self-directing mechanism to develop into exactly what you are if you don't interfere. But there are those who want to put a time at which this fetus has no moral standing, now does have moral standing. I want to suggest the use of this language that I found helpful. Instead of using the language human embryo, Perhaps the language embryonic human is more accurate for what is actually going on. That when we say embryonic human, we are simply saying this is a member of the human family at a very, very, very early age of existence. But by self-ordering, self-directed biological processes, that entity that is now an embryo, then later a fetus, will in a predictable amount of time. I mean, doctors can tell a pregnant woman within a few days, this is when you're going to have your baby. That's how predictable this process is. That fertilized egg will develop on its own into an embryo, into a fetus, into a born baby if we don't interfere. These are actual pictures of this process. And this is where I've had people say, in fact, I was at a seminar at University of Arkansas Medical School in Little Rock, and there was a doctor speaking on embryonic stem cell research, and we're about at the stage a little later where we'd start harvesting those embryonic stem cells, and the doctor said, and then just laughed out loud, I didn't find it funny, but he looked at slides like this and he said, and to think some people think that's a baby. That's just not funny, Doc. I know it doesn't look like a baby now, but that's every one of you were that at some point. Every one of you in this room. You were a single cell. You were then an 8-cell stage. And then that developed and developed and developed until you were a baby. I find convincing the argument in reverse. Let's start with the infant. Do you believe that an infant at birth is morally protectable? How many of you believe that? That we're not going to start advocating killing babies. So my question is, well, did it have moral protection a week before birth? Oh yeah, of course. A month before birth? Yeah, I think so. How about a month and a half before birth? How about 2 months? When, in this natural progression of development, are you willing to say, all right, it's certainly protectable at birth, but now it's not protectable, so I can have an abortion? On what basis? Tell me. Are you making that argument? When you know that from the time this conception takes place, there is this natural development that always results in a human baby. These are actual pictures of the embryo at 8 weeks, when about around 70% of all abortions take place. But even at 8 weeks and earlier, even if you ask about human resemblance, would you agree we're already resembling a human being, even in terms of resemblance? Obviously we are. By 20 weeks, there is no one who can look at that and say, whoa, I don't know what that is. No, this is a human baby in the womb at this point. Arkansas just passed what is called the pain-capable abortion bill that limits abortions after 20 weeks. It will probably, the way things are going in America, it will probably be declared unconstitutional at some point. But I'm glad the good folks of Arkansas were able to get it through. I'm going to have to rush through some of this. There has actually been surgery performed in the womb. This made the news back in 1999 when a 20-week fetus, later named Samuel R. Moss, had a surgery in the woman's womb. You're actually looking at the woman's womb lifted up out of the abdominal place, and they are doing surgery. The infant fetus's little hand has come out of the incision made in the uterine wall. We are able, in this case, to correct some of the, it was an issue of spina bifida, but able to be corrected by surgery. Did surgery in the womb, closed back up the incision, put the uterus back in the woman's body, sewed her up, and this is what you have 9 years later. Now, my question is simply, is this the same guy or a different guy that we did surgery on? I think it's the same guy. So this critical question, if we start with birth at 40 weeks, when are you willing to back up and say, all right, we have a morally protectable entity at birth. We're not for murdering babies. Well, when are you going to back this up? And then my next question is, what is your moral justification, your biblical justification for doing that? What is it? What has changed in the moral, biological standing of this entity? On what moral basis are you arguing it's protectable at birth, but not at whatever stage interests you there? And I believe it to be a very strong point that conception is the only stage when something morally significant changes. Let me get to that point. None of you in this room were ever a single sperm or a single egg cell. If you take an egg cell and a sperm cell and they never join, all you will ever have are an egg cell and a sperm cell. We know biology this much. Once you combine egg and sperm in fertilization, now something different takes place. There is an exchange of genetic information where this single cell zygote now has a different genetic complement than either the mama or the daddy. It is a unique genetic complement. As if to even single biologically, something just happened. But also the obvious, 9 months later, something will happen. Every one of you in this room were once a zygote. Every one of you. Every one of you in this room was once an embryo. This argument of the continuity of personal identity from conception onward, I think, is a very strong argument. This is a picture of my granddaughter Ella in the womb. This is a picture of my sweet precious Ella through the years. These are some of the last pictures, Christmas a couple of years ago. Is that a different person? If this baby is wanted, it's not a different person. We name the baby in the womb. We talk about the baby in the womb. We decorate the nursery. We send out, come to the birth party announcements. It's not that the status of the fetus has changed. It's that my disposition toward it has changed. Whether it's wanted or not. I won't go there. I don't want to get mad at Texas right now. I thought some really stupid things were said in some protests at Texas recently, but we don't have time. The difference between a fetus, an infant, and adult, I would argue, are only a matter of the size, location, environment, and developmental stage. I think those are the only differences. There's nothing different about nature. There's nothing different about the kind of entity you are. It is only the size, the location, the environment, and your developmental stage. You remember the fuss when the new King of England was born? I mean, poor Kate is barely pregnant before we're already saying what? This is the new King of England. I'm saying, no, it's not. It's just a fetus. You see, when the baby is wanted, we even call it the next King of England. When it's not, we just say a lump of biological material. Let's be honest, that's the issue. It's not that the fetus has changed. It's that I and my attitude have changed about it. We're just within a couple of minutes, so I want to give you, here's my overall approach to this biblically. I don't believe you can solve it at the rule level. There is no verse in the Bible that says thou shalt not have an abortion. It's just not there. You might argue, but the sixth command, you shall not kill or you shall not murder. That only applies if you've already convinced someone that the fetus is an entity that has moral standing. So you first have to argue that before you can apply the sixth command to it. The closest thing you have is in Exodus 21 when two men are fighting and they injure a pregnant woman and her fetus is miscarried and then there are various fines and punishments assessed. That's not parallel to abortion because that was accidental injury. With abortion, we're talking about intentional injury. So in my judgment, this ultimately has to be solved at the principle level, and these are some of the principles that I think are critical. The principle of selfless love of neighbor. For the early church, this was the primary one. You look at the writers of the first 2 or 3 Christian centuries, this is what they said. I am against abortion because the Bible teaches us to love our neighbors as ourselves. The fetus in the womb at minimum is a very near neighbor. The principle of protecting the weak and the innocent and the defenseless. The fetus, the human fetus in mama's womb is perhaps the only human being in America who has no voice. No one speaking for him or her. The principle of respect for human life. We're created in the image and likeness of God. The principle of assuming responsibility for your actions. Abortion for many, not for all, but abortion for many has become a kind of birth control. A way to conveniently get out of a problem that we brought on ourselves. Are there more biblical ways to do so? I tell my students at Harding, yes, you have autonomy and you exercise free choice when you decide to have consensual sex. Once you decide to have consensual sex, live up to your choices. Man up to it. Be a woman, a godly woman about it. Your choice was to start having sex. One of those choices, one of the outcomes can be a pregnancy. Start owning up to the responsibility. And the principle of allowing God to bring good even out of a bad situation. Well, if you come back again, we'll go through all of my biblical response to Roe v. Wade. But let me end with this, with your permission. This is Jessica. Jessica turned 30 a year ago in 2013. In November of 12, she posted this on Facebook. I think she was thinking about her biological mother, unwed, pregnant. And Jessie wrote this beautiful reflection, still brings tears to my eyes when I read it. She says, I am thankful that 30 years ago a teenage girl got pregnant and decided not to have an abortion. And that my parents hadn't been able to have a child biologically. God knew what family we were supposed to be. I'm so grateful that I was loved so much by my God, my parents, and that strong young woman to be given the life I have. It is really, really, really hard for me not to bring this into this discussion. Because I'm the father of 3 adoptive children. And I praise those birth mothers. I pray for them regularly. And I praise God for them. That they found themselves in a very, very traumatic situation. And they owned up into responsibility. They made what I believe was a good and godly decision to let Liz and I raise the children they couldn't. Jessie is now teaching English as second language at Georgia State University. She's a godly Christian woman. She and her husband are active in the Lord. And I think what might not have been if that young woman had made a different decision. God bless us to do what is right and biblical and good, I pray.